just about to say, today's a really big day, because today is the day that the Supreme Court is hearing arguments from the state of Mississippi about the potential case that could overturn Roe v. Wade. The 50-year precedent, 50 years. Now, we'll talk more about that when we get to a certain point in the lecture, but I was listening to it on the way in. Some stations have gone nothing but Supreme Court coverage today. This case here is right now being perceived as one of the major cases in American legal history, and we'll see how it goes. It's going to be one of those that you should watch and pay attention to. Every American should. It'll teach you how the Supreme Court works, but it'll also, there's a lot into these cases in terms of how the law is handled. And I'm going to stick to that. I'm not going to get into the issues. That's a personal thing for y'all. But here's the deal, right? So we're talking about the court system here and all these different cases. And you guys know that, of course, we have a First Amendment, right? And what was the quintessential case, the first case that defined the two separate clauses? Do you remember the name of the case? Yeah. And where did it originate? Here in Utah, right? Okay, so this case is laid out the framework, and this becomes, and here's a key word for the lecture today, the stare decisis. Now that's Latin, comes from a Roman term. The Romans were big on the law, but they were also big on when they passed a law through the Senate, and then they had judicial rulings on the law, that they stayed consistent. They weren't about to change the law every 5 minutes, because that creates instability. It's like with Hammurabi's Code. Why was the written law so important with Hammurabi's Code? Well, it was really important because everybody knew what the law was. So it was consistent. Inconsistency in the law is a real problem. You can't just every case make a new decision. So you take what we call, very important here, the precedent. The precedent, the first case, the Reynolds case in this case, sets the tone for all cases to follow. You don't just make up everything. You go back to what was originally decided. Here's the key point. What was originally decided, and you stick with it. Law has a history, and you go back in time. So here's the deal. The cases we talk about in a class like this are the very few, extremely few, dare I say that again, very few cases that break the precedent and depart from stare decisis. So when we talk about Brown versus Board, 1954, huge case, it broke with precedent that was set 80 years earlier in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, which broke from a case that was another 80 years before that, the Dred Scott case. The truth of the matter is, all right, today's hearing doesn't happen very often. Only a few times really in a lifetime. So the Reynolds decision, even though it's 1878, the basic rulings of this, religion is not a license for extreme behavior, like we showed the example of Warren Jeffs and Brian David Mitchell, your religious views can't protect you from kidnapping, which is really what both of them were accused of in ways. So here's the deal now. We also know that the First Amendment, the first line, 2 lines really, 2 clauses, have to do with freedom of religion. Obviously, when they wrote it, that was an issue. And I think it's appropriate that it's first, right? It kind of makes sense when you look at the whole thing. Because remember, everywhere else in the world, the government of that country would choose a favored religion and even collect taxes and tithings for it. I was hearing a little podcast about early English history. We're talking 1600s here, and how local landlords would collect the tithes for the church from their people that lived on their land forcibly collected it and then would give it to the church. It was not voluntary, right? Because the churches had to be maintained. The monasteries had to be maintained. It created this huge political structure. And if that's what the whole world's doing, then is it only natural that they should do that same thing in Virginia? That's why this letter to the Danbury Baptists was so important, and I may come back to this later. Now, McCollum was an important decision because look how much later it is from the Reynolds case. Here, we're talking about what's appropriate to spend taxpayer dollars where every single person in the community pays taxes for this school. Is it appropriate that it become a forum for religious instruction for one religion over another? The people in McCollum made the argument, yeah, but we have a variety of choices to choose from. That's not the point, because you can't really ameliorate everybody's expectations. And I told you about this, but I didn't go to it at the time. Let's see if I can find it. Again, yeah, here it is. You look at this demographics of the United States right here. This is religious affiliation, right? So Catholicism, Protestantism, Mormonism's in there, unaffiliated. Look at the unaffiliated, it's 29% now. So the stat I gave you the other day is now woefully out of date with this new census data. Judaism, here we go, that's that sliver. Islam, that's that sliver. Buddhism, that's the sliver here, and other religions here, I guess to be named later, and people that just didn't answer the question. That's our slice, but it's more complex than that. So do we pick Protestant Christianity versus Catholicism? If they're the majority, well, do you go with the majority? But then that doesn't that oppress the rights of the minority? The Bill of Rights, very important, was written to protect the rights of the minority, not the majority. Because if you were listening to the lecture on Plato, the majority can protect their own rights because they can control the laws. They can control the courts. Who controls them? What keeps a majority from becoming a tyranny? The example I gave you in Missouri of the extermination order of this group right here. Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, literally exterminated out of a state. Thou shalt not be of this religion in this state, get out of here, go away. That happened. Minority group persecuted by a majority group, mostly people who were slave owners who wanted to see them out because most of them came from northern states. That's what the Bill of Rights is meant to protect. Now, why couldn't the Constitution and the courts protect the Mormons in Missouri at that time? It's a very important question. I'm going to open this up. See if you know the answer. I gave it to you yesterday. Why in the 1830s could they not protect them? Yes. That was part of the story, and it's an important part of the story, but I'm talking about the federal government. Why couldn't the federal government have intervened to protect the Mormons from the mob? Yeah.
Isn't it because of the, I think it's the 18th Amendment?
You're close. And your answer's not wrong. It's just a part of the story that's important, but
Isn't it the 14th Amendment where?
There you go.
It made the federal government where states cannot infringe upon civil rights.
Exactly right, 100% right. So here's the Bill of Rights. Does it apply to everybody? No. Here's what it says. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or the exercise thereof. It was only a prohibition against the federal government taking those rights away. Could states take away those rights? Up until the 14th Amendment. Yes. Let me give you the prima facie example. Slavery was never a federal thing, national government. It was always a state thing. The states enslaved people. Each state in the South had laws to enslave people. They made it a property right to own another person in that state. And that's what the Civil War was fought over, was whether or not people could enslave somebody in another state, take away the minority's rights to even any basic freedom. And it necessitated a civil war. So the result of the Civil War was the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment then says, states, guess what? You can't take away anybody's freedoms anymore. It's we, the people of the nation, that matter more than your individual rights at your state level. Does it make sense? So that is what makes, as you explained so well, the 14th Amendment the most powerful tool in the Constitution. Right. So now let's take a look at our pledge. You don't need to stand up for this, and we'll just kind of rehearse it. You guys stood up enough for this. Let's go through it. This is our pledge reading. I pledge allegiance to the flag. You know, I'm just going to read it to you. Here you go. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, was added about 80 years later during the Cold War. One nation, under God, indivisible, with the 14th Amendment for all. The liberty and justice part is the 14th Amendment part. Remember, when you say the pledge, it is the Union victory chant. There you go. When you get to liberty and justice for all, just think 14th Amendment. Can you imagine trying to mandate the Pledge of Allegiance in South Carolina a decade after the war?
That's the Yank victory chant.
Exactly right. I mean, it was like basic in your face.
Okay, we lost. You don't gotta rub it in.
That's pretty much right. You see, the thing is, I think that's why Texas has one of their own that they do. It's just, they have a Texas chant. But that's really the power of it. It was the Union taking a victory lap. And it caught on in schools and then became a thing. And now we say it every day. But I think it's kind of important to say, with liberty and justice for who? All. That's the 14th Amendment. And that's pretty powerful stuff. So don't just gloss over that bit. It has real meaning. Unless, of course, you were vanquished in the Civil War, as you just said, right? Now, here's the deal. Look at these churches. Let's start with the A. African Methodist Episcopal, African Methodist Episcopal, American Baptist Association, Amish, American. We're not even out of the A's yet. Let's go in on and on and on and on and on it goes. Look at that list. Look at that. Look at this list. It goes on and on and on and on and on. Zoroastrianism at the bottom. I love that. Why? We brought a bunch of Yazidi immigrants from Iraq after ISIS tried to wipe them off the planet for their Zoroastrianism, because apparently that doesn't jive with ISIS. Anyway, you move along here and you see all these Sikhism. There's Sikhism that comes from northern India. Scientology, Salvation Army. It's an actual church. Reformed Church of America. All right, so you get the idea here. So McCollum then said, you can't pick 5 or 10 or even 20 or 50 or even 100 different little things to have, because there's no way to accommodate everybody. And then what about those who are unaffiliated? Where do they go? So this became the stare decisis. Now, as we explained yesterday, Utah gets around this decision of McCollum quite cleverly. Let me list the factors. We discussed it yesterday, but I'm reviewing here. Number one, it's on private property. I told you when I was a kid, we had 5 different seminaries across the street from my high school, 5 different ones. This was in Salt Lake. So lots of kids had lots of choices there. But here's the thing, it's not really the kid's choice. It's the parent's choice. Can the parents pull you out? Can your parents pull you out for a doctor's appointment? Can they pull you out to go to the dentist? Can they pull you out for a family vacation? Can they pull you out to send you to some form of alternative instruction? Yes. I've had students get pulled out early because they wanted to participate in football at a local high school, right? Or some sport. Parents are ultimately in control here, and that's important. Teachers are your parents in the absence of your parents. In other words, our job is to try to get you to pay attention and get good grades, as your parents would do, right? But we're not a substitute for your parents. Your parents are the ones releasing you, which they have the right to do in Utah law. So now, are we forcing anybody to sit in a publicly funded taxpayer school and listen to religious instruction that favors one religion over another? And that's the other key point. The government, meaning the school, is not putting its thumb on which religion is best. That's important to know. So contrary to some people who suggest that this is anti-religion, it's quite the opposite. The First Amendment rests upon the principle that both religion and government can best work to achieve their lofty aims. We teach science, we teach math, we teach history, so on. If each is left free from the other within its respective sphere. And I submit this is an argument that's often made, but I tend to believe it. The reason so many religions flourish in the United States is because we don't pick a winner. Name me some countries where they pick a winner. Afghanistan, ring a bell? Iran, ring a bell? So this freedom of religion thing is really important. So now let's get to a little bit new material. That was kind of the wind up to this and review, okay, for those of you getting ready for your final. And as we look at this here, let me get this to present. There we go. This was our situation, right? We had different colonial patterns based upon different cultures coming in at different times in our history. So it created this melting pot. Well, I don't know if that's much as a melting pot as a, well, they often call it, you know, a fruit salad. I mean, you got all sorts of things in this bowl, right? And so you just kind of toss it up a little bit, and some people move here and move there, but you're not going to have a melting pot when it comes to religion. That concept, you know, isn't there. And the guy that learned it the first was Jefferson. Here's the deal. Evangelicals versus Anglicans. Anglicans first settled Virginia. They were the ones that got to the prime land first. They were the ones that set up those big plantations. People like Washington's family had been there for generations. At Mount Vernon, they had a very profitable tobacco farm, tobacco industry. So the newcomers had to go somewhere else. And that was in the more frontier regions of Virginia. Now, when the Anglicans came, they were the only game in town. But when the new people came from all over the world, things in the backcountry changed religiously. But the law in the Commonwealth of Virginia from 1624 mandated that Virginians worship in the Anglican Church or the Church of England, which would be supported by the upkeep of their taxes. This would not have been uncommon in 1620. In fact, this would have been the common thing throughout all of the countries in Europe, especially in England. Dissenters from Protestant sects resented the legal restrictions placed on their own practice of religion. We're paying to build your church up. What are we doing for ours? So you see that there's going to be a real tension here already. Now, we got to fast forward quite a while here. So the mid 1700s, the 18th century. Evangelical Christians at this point would include Baptists, Presbyterians, a lot of those came from Scotland, Methodists, and so on. And they just thought these practices were discriminatory. Here's a picture right here. This is the most famous Anglican church in Williamsburg, Virginia, the capital of Virginia. No other denominations were allowed to build anywhere near it. Gave it exclusivity in the town. The law mandated that Virginians worship in the Anglican Church. You're a Virginian, you are Anglican. It's like saying you're English, you go to the Church of England, the Anglican Church. That was just expected. The church was supported by tax dollars. So basically here, the line between religion and the civil authority, meaning the government, were blurred, as it was everywhere. Virginia was just following the practices that we inherited from jolly old England and France and everywhere else. Evangelical churches were restricted by law as to where they could build, and that was outside of city limits. And then they had to pay for it all themselves and couldn't use the tax money for their churches. By the time we get to 1786, Jefferson's governor of Virginia, and he wrote a law. He actually penned this himself. Listen very carefully for those of you who care about your country. I think this is more important than the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is not really in our law so much until the 14th Amendment made much of it real, but all men are created equal, right? Ideal goals, inalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Yeah, great, but it's not the Constitution, is it? It was a rallying cry for the American Revolution. This was actually put into law in Virginia and became the model. This was before the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And few years before the Constitution was passed and we started our country and wrote the First Amendment. So we're talking 5-6 years ahead of this, of the First Amendment. This right here, it's called the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom. It's based on natural law, as you will see. And this is out of the mind of Thomas Jefferson, truly one of the great minds of American history, no doubt about it, and recognized worldwide, by the way. The Declaration made him famous around the world. I don't actually know that or not, but okay. So here's what he says in the law. You ready? Well aware that Almighty God hath created the mind free. Key line. He has invented, out of his intellectual reasoning, a new natural law that some philosophers had danced around a little bit, but he just come out and says it. The mind is free. That all attempts to influence it by temporal punishments or burdens or civil incapacitations tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness. Look at the stories from the Holocaust of people in that terrible situation, and yet they were able to produce great thought, great ideas. They were able to continue in their mind, even though they were so limited by their circumstances. Even in slavery, the mind is still born free. And if you try to take that away, free thought, by putting fines and burdens and sending people to jail and all that kind of stuff, well, that's hypocritical and mean, because you have the right to think freely, so should they. And because they arrive at different conclusions than you punish them because you're the majority. So he's unraveling 200 years of Virginia law here. This is a good example of overturning the stare decisis, stare decisis. Okay, so the mind is born free. Any attempt to limit it begets habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and our departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion. Okay, it was still a very religious time, so you're going to, see a lot of language in there that is appropriate for that time period. But here's the law itself. Be it therefore enacted that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever. You shouldn't have to pay taxes for someone else's church. You shouldn't have to be forced to go. Nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or beliefs. If your religious opinions differ from someone else, it shouldn't impact your ability to do well in school, to get a good job, to hold a government position, or run for office. but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion. Now, here's the thing. He said, have your debate, discuss. Freedom of speech. You share your ideas, you share your ideas. That's okay. But the same shall in no way diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. And what that means is your ability to function in society. Because you dress differently because of your religion, because you have your day off, so to speak, for religious worship might be Friday instead of Sunday or Saturday. In all the hiring practices we have, we have to accommodate people from around the world. I mean, we're in 28 countries. We've got to be aware of the holidays and how people worship in different places, right? And accommodate for that in our business model. Because we don't want anybody diminished in their ability to contribute because we've been, hypocritical and mean. We are free to declare and do declare that the rights hereby asserted are of the natural rights of mankind. Thank you, Aristotle. And that if any act shall be hitherto passed to repeal it, there would have been those that would say, no, we need to be an Anglican state. Talking about the Commonwealth of Virginia. He's saying, I imagine this was a tough law to get passed, but when he got it passed, he said, and if any act shall be hereafter passed to repeal the present or to narrow its operation, such act will be an infringement on natural right. It's one of the most positive views of the use of natural law that I can think of. It's revolutionary in world history in 1786. Remember, predating the Constitution itself and the Bill of Rights by at least 5 years. Now you know where Madison's getting his thoughts when you put this together. Jefferson wrote his own tombstone, by the way. You can visit, it's right down the hill from his home, Monticello. Here lies Thomas Jefferson. You can't read it, but I'll read it to you. Author of the Declaration of American Independence. He was proud of that. Of the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom, and the father of the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia. Look, he could have said President of the United States, person who purchased Louisiana, ambassador to, he could have gone on. The list could have gone on and on and on. But the three things that mattered to him, obviously, all men are created equal. You gotta love that line. It's all the only line anybody ever remembers. There's a lot more to it than that. It's brilliant, really. The Statute of Virginia for religious freedom is right there. And then education, expanding education in Virginia. Whoa. I guess we know what's important, right? Treat everybody equally. And oh, by the way, that pertains to religion too. It's genius. And it found its way into another spot in the Constitution, because you guys are going to sit there, and if you're paying attention right now, you're going to see, oh, wait a minute, this could be important. In Article 6 of the Constitution, it says this: the senators and representatives before mentioned, Article 1, and members of the several state legislatures, they applied this to the state legislatures, and all executive and judicial officers, court officials, all that, both of the United States and of the several states shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support the Constitution. This is why when you go into the military at your induction, you take an oath to preserve, protect, and defend not a president who happens to be there now, not a Congress, but the Constitution itself. It's a big moment. It's a big deal. It's emotional. I'll never forget my son's induction into the Air Force. It was a monumental moment to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. But here's the next thing: but no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any oath or public trust under the United States. That's on the state level, that's on the local level, that's everywhere. If you feel like somebody's denying you your civil capacities, to quote Jefferson. In other words, your right to participate fully in the society because of your faith. Oh my goodness. You might want to consider hiring a good lawyer because it's just out of bounds. Constitution says so. Remember Article 6, no religious test. So wait a minute. So how come it took so long to get our first Catholic president? Because while the government can't do that, people can still when they vote, right? There's no separation of church and politics, as I keep saying. It's the separation of church and state, what we're talking about. Do you see the difference now? Right? People can have their prejudices and their opinions and their thoughts. Well, that's fine. That's, you're okay with that, right? That's the basic sentiment of what Jefferson was talking about. And it can turn into a vote. Well, I'm going to vote for that person because I can relate to them, whatever. But when it comes to our government, they can't take away any of your rights and freedoms based upon your religion. So that is one of the greatest inventions of human rights in world history. And I just wish more countries could adopt it. Of course, they're going to do it in France, and they're going to do it in the European Union, and they're going to do it, in places all over the world over time. But this was really the biggest statement ever made in that regard. So now back to the First Amendment itself. Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting free exercise thereof. Are the two clauses different? Yes, they are. Which case decided that? Okay, just think about that answer. The amendment itself is amazingly well written. It's 5 separate clauses, right? Religion, press, speech, assembly, petition. Sometimes it's called the 5 freedoms or the freedom of expression amendment. Religion, press, speech, assembly, petition, right? Hint, hint. All right, now, how do we protect those rights? You go to court. You go to court. If you've been harmed by somebody based on the law, you have what we call a right to sue. If you don't like a law, but it doesn't affect you personally, can you sue? No, because you have to be actually in a situation where you are affected directly. Okay, so you can't bring, this prevents what we call frivolous cases, right? Now, you guys all remember the Judiciary Act 1789, okay? 1 Supreme Court, 3 circuit courts, 13 district courts, all that, of course, expanded dramatically over time. We have 94 now district courts, 13 circuit courts, and 1 Supreme Court today, 9 members on the court today. Who determines the number of courts and how big they are? How many people, how many judges there are? Who determines that? Congress, yeah. If you say the courts, no, okay, or the president, no. It's Congress determines what the size and shape of, because they have to pay for it. They actually have to fund it. And you guys know about your 13 different circuits. Now there's a case right now that's being argued today. And when you present your arguments, it's called oral arguments, right? And you go in front of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the court of last resort. The case we're going to talk about here, the Mississippi case went through the state of Mississippi District Court. Then it went to the appeals court. They came up with a ruling. Now this case, I think it was a year or so later, is now being heard today, this moment, during this class, at this second. This is for those listening at home later, this is December 1st, right, of 2021. And it's one of the biggest cases ever. And the problem is each of these different circuits has ruled differently on similar cases. So we have cross-regional differences. So this is time for the Supreme Court to step in. And let me just get rid of this on my apologies. I just want to make sure this is clean. Okay. All right, let's get rid of that. Okay, so let's go back to view here. 50 years ago, the Supreme Court made a ruling on abortion. Now, this is important to note. Listen very carefully. There is no national law passed by Congress on this issue. All the laws regarding abortion are state level. I don't think you'll ever see a federal law, a national law that covers abortion for the whole country. This is what we call a third rail topic and issue. Now listen carefully, let me explain what I mean by that. Will we have a hard time? Well, I don't think we could debate this rationally or even civilly. I had an experience about 7 years ago now where it came up in class and we were discussing it. It was a disaster. It was one of those moments where people were not respecting each other's thoughts or ideas. It was too emotional. And I get it. It's such an emotional topic, it is. And so as a result, right, I had students that wouldn't speak to each other who had been friends for days later. That's a third rail. You know it's a third rail when it sparks that kind of emotion. A third rail goes back to the early trolley car and subway and train industry, where you have your rails, right? But then you have a third rail in the middle, which is electrified. It carries the electric current. So when the trolley comes up, it kicks into this section that has electrical power, pushes it to the next one, the next one, the next one. The problem is, if you walk down and touch that third rail when it's live, you're as good as dead. You can't even talk about some topics because they're third rails. This is one of those issues. Third rail. It's unbelievably important in our politics today. It's unbelievably emotional, right? So Roe v. Wade basically was a Supreme Court decision where they were looking at all these cases in the states coming through, and they said, let's just resolve it with one decision for all. Okay, so did they make law from the bench? Congress didn't make this law. A lot of people think, oh, this is a law. No, this was a decision of the court based on all these cases from the state level bubbling up through the system. And they passed it. Later, it was amended slightly in a case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which gave it 14th Amendment protection. It's a privacy right, according to Casey. So it's really these two cases now in combination that are being argued now with a Supreme Court that has been radically changed due to 50 years of political activism by those who want to see Roe v. Wade revisited. And the case that everyone says is the one that matters here is Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization coming out of Mississippi. That this has the potential, if not to overturn those two, to come up with an entirely new legal precedent. If this case does that, does it go through and break up the stare decisis? Yes, it's a rare event. In all the other cases, except for Casey, and there's a dozen every year, but the courts will say, wait a minute, we already decided that, Roe v. Wade and Casey, then this has to fit in that decision, right? So case after case after case coming through the states. But here's the deal. We already have 50 different state plans on this issue. You see how federalism keeps bubbling up? This is an issue that was left to the states. Now, when the states try to change those laws in their state, they run into Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. So the state of Mississippi now is challenging it, and they've got some really powerful new arguments. One of the key ones that, I mean, it's all there is right now on so many channels when you're dealing with the courts. And that is that, look, the technologies have changed in 50 years. A lot's changed in 50 years. And by the way, this decision is toxic. And maybe it should be left to each individual state. So that's where we're at. It's an historic day on the court. It's a monumental day. Wherever you are on this issue, and I applaud you for however you feel, because it's your right to have your own thoughts and opinions, right? As who said that? That was mind is born what? Free, yeah, Jefferson. I respect that, I really do. But this is a case you'll want to follow. You want to learn a little bit more about it, and you want to see what happens over the next day or so while they're hearing our oral arguments. I think it's going to just end today. I think it's a one-day deal. Then they're going to vote a few weeks later, and then the majority of the court will write an opinion, and the minority will write an opinion too. And those two opinions, right, will be published, but the majority opinion will be the one that will be whatever the new stare decisis becomes. This is a once in a half century event. The only case I can think of this magnitude since this time is 1954 Brown versus Board, which you guys all know, right? This is the one that where schools are not segregated anymore, or public spaces aren't segregated like 11 southern states did. You know, you had based on your race, you got assigned a school. What? What's that all about? That happened. In my lifetime, it happened. So yeah, that was a big one. Brown versus Board. This one, let's get the name right. Dobbs v. Jackson, very important. There's also another case too that we should probably talk about, and that's the Windsor case. Maybe I'll throw that one in at the end. Okay, now let's get to this cases we started on the other day, right? And that is the First Amendment cases. Now, which group has brought more cases to challenge different aspects of the First Amendment of laws that states and local communities pass than any other? Jehovah's Witness, that's right. And they have a magazine called The Watchtower, and the Watchtower Society publishes it. And here was a village of Stratton, California, who just wanted, you know, people were complaining, people keep coming up to me with trying to convert me to their religion and all that kind of stuff, or hand me pamphlets and whatever. And it was a lot of different religions. It wasn't just the Jehovah's Witness, it was lots of different groups. And they passed a local law that says, wait a minute, you can't go door to door and knock on people's doors and with your religious message, and you can't go into our public square, which basically means, you know, our streets and our parks and so on, and preach. All right. You need a permit for that. And we're going to deny the permits. And we're also, you know, if any of your material that you're passing out ends up on the ground, we're going to charge you with littering, and you're going to have to pay to clean it up. So there was even a fine attached. Well, this is an interesting case because the Jehovah's Witness took it up, and basically the case was decided this way. In the Jehovah's Witness case against this Watchtower Society B, that's versus, right, Village of Stratton, local laws cannot stop religious groups from going door to door to share their message. That's proselytization, right? Proselytize, or to pass out literature. Churches can come up to your religious people, come up to your door, knock on your door, and talk to you. You don't have to answer. It's your, if you don't want to, but if they come to your door, you have to allow it. A lot of people say, wait a minute, but I got a no solicitation sign on my house. That only applies to people selling you products. This right here, religious messages can't, you know, they can't stop people from at least trying to share their message at your doorstep. And also politicians have that same freedom. If it's politics, if it has to do with elections, they can come up and share with you their political message. So those two are protected. But if they're selling you something, your community can stop that. And no one sells in your neighborhood, by the way, door to door, unless they have a permit from the city and they have to pay a bit of a fee usually. Here's the next case, really an important one. Wisconsin versus Yoder. Now this one's fascinating because the Amish want to live apart from the rest of society. I don't know how much you know about the Amish, right? But they don't want a lot of new technology into their community, whatever. They consider it a distraction. I think I know what they're talking about. But by the same token, they're amazing agriculturalists. So when it comes to high tech and agriculture, they're as good as you get. But they do it in a different way. And they feel like their lifestyle is better perpetuated, right, if they don't send their kids to public school. And Wisconsin had a law that says, thou shalt go to school. Every state has that. That movement started in Massachusetts and spread across the country where it's compulsory education. For their religious views, should Yoder, he was Amish, should he be forced to send his kids to public school when they have an entire different system of life, economy, and whatever, apart from society itself? Well, I'll leave that one hanging and we'll decide that one tomorrow, okay? So that's where we'll end for today. But there's no more interesting cases, I think, than the ones we see here with the First Amendment. And the idea, don't forget the key concept today, stare decisis. 50 years ago, stare decisis was set by Roe v. Wade. This case, 50 years later, has a chance to create a new precedent, which is rare in court history. Okay, let me stop the share and end that. Question, hand at the back.